Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah, and I'm going to be walking through a framework that I published recently on my Medium called the Hierarchy of Marketplaces. And goal here is just to synthesize some of the learnings I've had on building enduring marketplaces. This is actually normally more like a 45-minute presentation, and I'm going to go at breakneck speed and skip over a few different concepts. And so highly recommend kind of thinking this as an introduction and going to my Medium for some of the more in-depth views. So why talk about marketplaces? Marketplaces are one of these incredible businesses where if you get to a place where you have real dominant market leadership, you have this incredibly profitable business that is protected by strong network effects. And it's the type of business that we all think about, as VCs, as founders of, the types of businesses that you really hold up and say that is the dream to get to. But they're incredibly difficult to start and even harder to win. And so the question that I tackle here is how do you maximize your chances? I won't bore you with my background or the experience at Benchmark, but suffice to say that there's just a real depth of marketplace experience here, both for me as an investor and then also as an operator at Pinterest, and then of course the experience that we had at Benchmark. So the hierarchy of marketplaces has 3 levels, but the core insight that I think underpins this hierarchy is that you have to start from the goal of becoming number 1 by a wide margin. When you're building a marketplace, like you are the goal, the reason why you're going through all the hardship of building a marketplace is to get to this number 1 position where you have just incredible network effects, incredible profitability. And so then as the founder, you have to start from that goal and work backwards from there. So if the goal is to dominate whatever market that you're going after, you have to figure out how to get the market to tip. And so that's level 2. And in order to get a market to tip, you have to focus on an incredibly constrained problem. And so let's go through each of those from the bottom up. So let's start with focus. So obviously, when you're starting a marketplace, your goal, you have to kickstart transactions. You're doing all these things that don't scale in order to get transactions going. But the mistake I see a lot is that your goal when you're starting this marketplace is not just to grow transactions. It's not this race to increase, have that GMV number going up into the right. Your goal is actually to create meaningfully more happiness with every transaction than any substitute would be able to do in the market you're going after. And just to kind of run through a few case studies very quickly, I mean, Uber versus taxis. Like when Uber started, taxis were so much bigger than Uber, and yet over the course of a few years, Uber eclipsed taxis. So the question is why? If they're so much bigger, how did Uber win? DoorDash versus Postmates is a case study I come back to quite a lot. Postmates was started a year and a half before DoorDash. They were both going after the San Francisco Bay Area. They both used almost the same exact tactical techniques to kickstart, and yet DoorDash won. Why? And Goat versus eBay, I love this example just because, you do a search on eBay for Nike sneakers as an example, and there's almost 200,000 results. And so when Goat started, it was so small relative to eBay, and yet they've been able to kind of eclipse eBay in terms of the brand and the scale there. And so the question is why? And the answer is that buyers and sellers, how big a marketplace is irrelevant to them. What a buyer and seller cares about is how happy you make them versus any substitute. And what I mean by happy is the transactions, it's kind of the whole end-to-end experience of a transaction and the strength of the value that they get from that transaction. So more efficient, stronger matches, better economics, more trust that just makes the whole process a lot easier, an overall better experience. And the process that you go through as a founder when you're building, or a product leader, or whoever you may be in one of these marketplaces, is that you have this relentless relentless, Amazon, still dealing with this pursuit of exceeding expectations to create happiness and never resting on your laurels there. And so to maximize happiness, you have to focus on a constrained problem. The thing I always say is that, everybody wants to win the ocean, but you can't, if you try to be everything for everyone and boil an ocean, you're just never going to get there. And so you really want to focus on this very, very constrained problem. DoorDash going after the suburbs versus Postmates diving headfirst into San Francisco, which was a much bigger piece of, like a much bigger market technically to go after, but just a lot harder to win. And they went after multiple different categories versus the very, very focused thing that DoorDash went after, which is selling, doing food delivery in the suburbs. And you want to use product and policies, not just supply. And I say that because there's always this orientation when you're building a marketplace of supply, supply, supply. But it is a lot about product and policies in that beginning that kind of really optimize for that white hot center, that super constrained problem that you're focusing on. And, I love, GOAT here as an example, but I'll just, in the sake of time, let's talk about Uber. Why did Uber eclipse taxis? It was just such a better experience. You had these, the taxi coming to you, you had the frictionless payment, you knew that you were going to get a good driver. And eventually it became cheaper than a taxi. And so Uber just kept on finding ways to increase the happiness that a buyer would have, really, and then the sellers too, for using Uber. And that's the, the inevitability that happens when you're able to make your buyers and sellers much happier than the substitute, which at the time was taxis. And so how do you know if you're creating enough happiness? Like ultimately what it comes down to is net revenue retention. You're looking at how your cohorts perform over time. But day to day, the way that I think about it is that you want to kind of understand or hypothesize of what is the experience that I think for my buyers and my sellers, my suppliers, whatever they may be, will create an experience for them that gets them to retain. And so, as an example, you might hypothesize that if you're starting a ride sharing company, that it is, you open the app, 5 minutes later, you get a car, and then you end up rating that driver a 4 or 5. So that's what I would say if I were starting my ride hailing app tomorrow. Is a happy experience, is what I would call happy GMV, or a happy path of an experience. And then you track each step of the way how you're doing operationally in converting people through that funnel. And it helps you see the levers that you can tune to get more operational, improve that happiness conversion as you wait for your cohorts to mature. But ultimately what you're looking for is a place where you're able to tune the product and the experience enough where you find a place where the cohorts for your buyers and sellers plateau. And what I usually see when I'm looking at marketplaces is that there's usually one side of the marketplace. For example, with Uber, you'd say it's on the demand side, where you have net revenue retention that is above 100%. You get a very, very beautiful retention graph on one side, where the other side you have to constantly get people in the funnel to replenish the supply side. Airbnb is the opposite, where the hosts likely have net revenue retention that's incredibly high because there's so many ways for the host to expand their footprint, but that the actual use case on the demand side isn't as frequent. And so it's harder to see the net revenue retention on the supply side, on the demand side, but that's kind of how marketplaces tend to work, is usually there's one or the other where there's a particular strength on the retention. So let's say, and I'm speeding through this, but I hope it's making sense. Let's say you get to that point where you're seeing that your cohort, like you've gotten enough right with the experience, with the white hot center that you're focusing on, and now you want to go from doing all these things that don't scale, which is kind of the playbook that you've developed in that first level, to figuring out the systematic ways that you can really get your flywheel spinning and get more and more scale. And that's what it comes down to tipping. You need to tip the market. So we've got the transactions going, and now we want to tip the market in our direction. And so some of you may have experienced this moment of tipping, and it's a pretty cool experience, because what you feel is you've been doing all these things that don't scale, and it can feel like you're pushing a boulder up a mountain, and then all of a sudden something gets easier. The market starts to tip in your direction, and it's this feeling of your network effect coming alive. And the first sign that you see is that your existing cohorts are starting to retain better and better. And so you're getting more and more transactions from each user. Each successive vintage of cohort is getting better and better. And then the second thing that you start to see, and this is the very, very strong signal, is that the mix of how buyers and sellers are coming to you inflects away from all the things that you're having to do to pull the market towards you, to actually the market coming to you, where you start to see the organic growth on the buyer and seller side increase as a percentage of your overall growth. And that is an incredibly important and wonderful sign. To get to this magic threshold, part of what happens is that you're actually getting to be a bigger and bigger percentage of the market. And so it's back to this, there's some moment when the amount of happiness that you create, excuse me, for your buyers and sellers is just so much bigger than any substitute that it becomes obvious for the buyers and sellers to come to you. And that usually happens once you've gone to enough product market fit, enough liquidity that it just it starts to become a stronger and stronger value proposition. And you can think of it as basically your flywheel starts to spin faster and faster, because as you get more penetration of a market, you're able to create more happiness. And so that means that even though in the first level, in the first level, I said, don't think about growing GMV, think about, creating happiness with each transaction. Now it's actually time to grow. And like I said before, in level 1, you do things that don't scale in order to grow. In level 2, we have to figure out the things that do scale to grow. And to do that, you have to identify and maximize what I call tipping loops. So these are loops that create momentum for your marketplace systematically. There are 2 types of loops. The first type of loop that people talk about a lot is this idea of growth loops, and I'll get through those. But the second type of loop, and the one that I think about a lot, is it's not just enough to grow the suppliers or the number of suppliers or the number of buyers. What you want to be able to do is figure out ways to help you grow while at the same time maintain happiness, if not increase happiness as you grow. And these 2 loops work together very symbiotically, and I'll talk you through it. So growth focused loops, you guys know these. These are the ones where you use your buyers, your existing buyers or your existing suppliers to help you grow. And so you have referrals that people use all the time. So, driver, enjoys driving. They refer a friend and then because they had such a great experience, and then that friend becomes a driver. And so you use an existing driver in order to help you acquire another driver. Happiness-focused loops, what I talked about before, help with the matching of making sure that even as you're bringing on more supply and more buyers, that the buyers find the right supplier with whom to match, and you have like an efficient way of basically removing the bad suppliers from your marketplace. So search ranking is a great way of doing that, where you know what creates a great experience for a buyer. And so you make sure that in the discovery experience, you use those attributes to make the best suppliers rise to the top and have the worst suppliers get lower visibility and therefore lower access to the buyers. And that's this virtuous loop, right? Where you have the buyers have a good experience because they match with a great supplier. You reward the suppliers that you want to reward because they're getting more and more benefit of having leaned in on your marketplace. And it helps you as a company scale because you're acquiring buyers and sellers without actually hurting the experience or having to hire a bunch of people in order to kind of vet quality of the suppliers coming on. So it's a huge, I think of it almost as like the kidneys for your marketplace. Reputation is another one that you guys, I'm sure, are all familiar with. That's just a huge part of helping buyers find the best suppliers. And so your job when you're building a marketplace is to, and a marketplace, a social, any kind of network really, is to identify these loops and then figure out the most efficient way to maximize them. And so, to use the example I gave before with Uber drivers, Uber introduced a financial incentive where if I'm a driver, I refer someone to Uber and they become a driver, I earn a referral bonus. And you would just see, when Uber introduced this and really pushed the edge of what was possible there, you would see blog posts from Uber drivers talking about Uber, and they would all have the referral codes. And some Uber drivers were making more money with the referrals than they were actually driving, but just this very efficient way of getting that loop to spin faster and faster. I'll skip this just in the interest of time, but there's other ways to maximize the kind of the reputation side. And what you want to do is you're at the same time as you are finding these loops and doing everything you can to maximize how much they can spin and how efficiently they can spin, you're also wanting to look at the entire experience that buyers and sellers are having. And it's this constant battle to remove more and more friction from the transaction. And just the way to think about it is that you're doing all this work to acquire buyers and sellers and to try to get all these loops spinning. But if you have a lot of friction in the transaction, then you're kind of losing so much of the power of that flywheel going round and round. And so constantly looking for ways to remove friction from an experience will let those loops spin faster and faster. And here are a bunch of ways, kind of questions to ask to see where you might have friction. And again, this is all up on my Medium. And so not all markets are susceptible to tipping. And this is one of those things where it's just so important when you're starting a company, a marketplace, to really be thoughtful about the market that you're going after. Because what would be, just a bad place to be is you do all the work in level 1 and you're doing all the work that you need to do in level 2 to get that flywheel spinning, and you never actually get to that moment where the market can tip. And that's, getting to that moment of market tipping is a huge increase in honestly the value of your company, the kind of the model and the efficiency that you'll be able to drive with that with your company. And so you don't want to be a marketplace that isn't able to tip the market. And so here are six hurdles to look out for. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to zoom through these, and they're on my Medium. So the first is competition. The obvious thing is you want to go where you can win. And the best way to win, the best way to be so much better than any alternative is honestly for the alternatives, the competition, to be crappy. And so, Postmates, when they went into San Francisco, they were competing against Grubhub and Caviar. And, there was just so much competition already in San Francisco, whereas DoorDash went after, this greenfield opportunity, which was the suburbs. And so, Postmates wasn't able to tip San Francisco. DoorDash was able to tip the suburbs. And so go where you can win and be long-term, not short-term greedy on the rake. You guys, market fragmentation is the most basic thing for getting a market to tip. You need the buyers and sellers to lean in on your platform in order to get to that moment of tipping. And if it's concentrated, you just will never be able to do that. making sure that you're adding equal value on the buy side and the sell side. It's one of those things that a marketplace, once it tips, can grow incredibly quickly. And if you haven't fully calibrated the value you're creating for both the buyers and the sellers, it can create real problems. Classic example is Groupon. Another example is ClassPass, of just there being a disequilibrium that got out of hand. Regulation makes is obvious. It can help a company or it can hurt a company, and so just being very aware and working within the existing regulatory framework if you can. Homogeneity of buyer need, just it's very hard to tip a market if what the buyers need is all the same, and just like you don't get as much benefit from increasing penetration in the market. And so always thinking through the homogeneity there. Inability to corner the buy side. This is back to, if the use case is too infrequent on the buyer side, it's really hard to actually be a marketplace versus just lead gen. And so you want to get to a point, I think ZocDoc struggled with this, Thumbtack struggles with this, where you become the place to go for the buyer, and you don't have to acquire the buyer each time they're going to make a transaction. Otherwise, you really end up just being lead gen. All right, so home stretch, which is dominating. So we're tipping the market, and now the question is, how do we win? Now, here's the core insight that I alluded to earlier. Schibsted is this conglomerate where they own, I think gosh, and now I'm embarrassed, I can't remember, I think it's a Norwegian company, where they have a portfolio of online classified websites, which is kind of the early, think Craigslist, early generation Web 1.0 online marketplace. And they did this analysis of all their online classified sites, and they realized that the bigger their site was than the number two, the more profitable it was. And it was this like incredible relationship where, it makes you realize that it's not just about being the leader by a little bit. The profitability, the value you're able to create and therefore also capture increases dramatically based on how much bigger you are than the number two. And so it's not enough to be number one. You want to be number one by a lot. And so that means it's time to dominate the competition. Now, how you run your race depends on your competitive landscape. So if you're lucky enough when you're building a marketplace where you have no competitors, then what you are doing is you're doing the land grab. And so first things first is that you want to go slow to go fast. So you want to develop your level 1 playbook, which is the things that don't scale when you're launching a new market, to get that flywheel starting to spin. And then putting that level 2 playbook to work, which is once it's starting to spin, getting the loops also spinning so that it starts to spin systematically. And so if you're a local marketplace and you realize it's a land grab because the competition isn't there, then basically you want to get these loops spinning in as many cities as you can handle. After you've figured out, again, you have to know what your level 1 and level 2 playbook is. But once you have those playbooks, then you want to go and capture as many cities as you can or categories as you can. And in parallel, you want to look for ways to broaden the use case that you're solving for and find more and more repeat usage for the buy side. And so, I think an easy example is, again, Uber going from it being the splurge to competing with a taxi and to actually competing with public transportation because you had the pool. Airbnb also expanding the use cases. And the thing that you just want to be careful for is staying consistent with your brand. And Etsy went through a period, a rough patch. I actually think going into the year before it went public, where the company started to chase GMV instead of happiness. And And what they ended up doing is they let any buyer, any seller onto the marketplace. And so there was all this mass manufactured stuff that would appear on Etsy. I remember having to deal with it at Pinterest because there was all this spam coming from Etsy that was these, mass manufactured stuff that, wasn't consistent with the brand that Etsy had created and the community that Etsy had created. And it was an uproar. The sellers weren't happy. The buyers were confused because they assumed that they were getting handmade stuff. And so Etsy went through a rough patch and then had to pull back, clean out the marketplace, and kind of be more consistent with their brand. And they figured it out, and then they've been able to grow again in an incredible way. When there is competition, what you want to do is ask yourself, are you at least 2x bigger than your next largest competitor? And if not, then my argument to you is that you have to just either keep focused on getting to that leadership position, or you have to cut your losses. You don't want to be putting good money after bad if you're in a city or a category where you're not going to win. And you also don't want to rest on your laurels. If you're just 1.5 times your number two, then you need to make sure that that lead is increasing, not decreasing. And so staying focused, putting more wood behind that arrow. If you are bigger than your next largest competitor, then you're doing something very similar to the land grab scenario that I described before, but you want to have a little bit more invested in the existing markets where you're number one to make sure that you don't lose that lead. And my last slide for you all today is that even if you think you've won, even if you are the CEO of a marketplace and you are 8x bigger than your next largest competitor, or you don't see any real competition, you can never rest on your laurels building a marketplace, because there have been plenty of incumbents. These are some of the more recent ones that have been leapfrogged, and always staying paranoid and continuing to focus on exceeding expectations of your buyers and sellers is the key. Thank you so much. And again, on my Twitter handle will link to my Medium, and that's my email address. Thank you so much.